Hi, and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, John Harney. Our game this episode is Civilization VI, ostensibly the sixth entry in one of the most famous video game series in the medium, which dates back to the first game's publication in 1991. Civilization VI has received strong reviews, and much of the praise has focused on the depth and well-roundedness of the gameplay experience. For many reviewers, the newest entry in the series is a classic Civ, matching the addictive one-more-turn gameplay with the faithful recreation of the series' central conceit. A civilization's journey from a lone settler plodding around grasslands to a superpower reaching for the stars. Joining me to talk about that journey is our guest, Tonio Andrade, Professor of History at Emory University and the author of 3 books, the most recent of which is The Gunpowder Age, China, Military Innovation and the Rise of the West in World History, published this year by Princeton University Press. Tonio's work seeks to complicate and break down broad assumptions about global history, which made him a great guest to come and talk to us today about Civ. Tonio, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Just very broadly to start, what do you think about the series' relationship to history, how we tell history, whether it's in the classroom or, in what some people call public history, what you might call popular history, how we consume history? I know that in your work now, not only are you you're a global historian, but you really are reaching out to broader audiences. Where does Civ come into those kind of dynamics?
I mean, the thing about Civ is, and each iteration is slightly different, obviously, but they all have a basic sort of meander your way through history, hopefully winning at the end.
Right.
What I think I use it, I assign it actually as a text in my graduate colloquium on world history to kind of talk about how we model history, especially over the long term. Mm-hmm. And there's a bunch of assumptions in it, that maybe aren't entirely realistic, but that's exactly the point. I think any history that we write as historians, no matter how many texts we look at and how careful we are, we're still making models and assumptions. And a video game is just a way to kind of inhabit a world of assumptions, almost a simulation that you enjoy being in. And then, talking about those assumptions in relation to what we might consider to be reality or, the manifold phenomena of existence, the sources, whatever,
right,
is I think how we kind of understand history, because we can never completely grab, the history itself. So we're always working with models, and this is just a sort of very tangible and kind of fun model. Although I have to say, not everyone finds it fun. Like some of my students, I found that in order to teach it appropriately, you have to actually give a few lessons. There's a bit of a barrier to entry. I think some of my students prefer reading, difficult books. They prefer Pomerantz to Civ,
Yeah, well, that's fascinating because I have given Civ, I gave Civ 5 to some undergrads last year, and just literally asked them to write, play 5 or 6 hours, and then kind of. The theory
5
was
or 6 hours.
I know. Well, those barriers to entry are there at all levels of education. I think
true, yeah.
It's true, and with undergraduates, it's they don't want to use that time to read complicated books for the most part, which is probably a good thing, I think, when you're young. But this idea of so which character did you have? That's another thing we get into, this idea of characters in Civ. But what you're saying, I think, feeds directly into something that our job as historians is to engage with this all the time, of course, but people do complain that Civ adopts a Whig pattern of history, or certainly kind of adopts this worldview or this historical view that matches up with that Whig view. I was hoping that you could share with our listeners and our viewers, what does that mean? And in your own work, how do you interact with those kind of assumptions of this Whig or progressive history?
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, when you say Whig history, I mean, that's talking about a kind of long view history, and I'd be curious to know how you would define that.
Well, I think that, so you have the longue durée and all these kinds of ideas. I suppose for me, at least in the conversations people have raised with me personally, and I see brought up online, is this kind of progressive aspect, this almost enlightenment aspect, going back to the Marquis de Condorcet, this idea that things are getting better, and specifically things are getting better thanks to technological industrial innovation, which matches the way that it happened in the world today. So, the conundrum, as you and I both know, for Asianists, for example, and you just mentioned Kenneth Pomeranz, this question of, the Industrial Revolution, why does it happen where it does? Why does it not happen in other places? And the difficulty, I suppose, we face in that structure, right? Because even if you're critiquing it, breaking away from it. So I was kind of inviting you to kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So I think,
Not a
um,
hard question at all. You know, it's
but it's that this question is, I think, at the heart of not just of Civ, but of history in general. That we have these meta narratives, these large stories, somewhat implicit, maybe um, more maybe explicit sometimes, that kind of guide what we do, because it's how we see the world going. Because history is not just about the past.
Mhm.
History is about the present reflecting on the past and heading to the future. I think all
Exactly.
historians, even we have one eye on the past and one eye on the future. Um, and that's one of the interesting things about Civ too. That dynamic, that sort of progress dynamic. Civ doesn't stop with the present. Civ goes on into the future, and as you mentioned, you can become a space traveling race and try to establish your civilization on other worlds and things like this. Um, and so, but that view of history, it's not just in civilization, in the games. It's in so much history that you see these days, and a lot of the debates. For example, it's funny that this is the third time we're going to mention Kenneth Pomerantz, but I think it's a really intriguing sort of counterpoint. So Kenneth Pomerantz, his argument, and many other people are arguing similar things. His argument is that the Whig interpretation doesn't work because, or at least it doesn't work for, it doesn't work at all, actually, because a lot of what caused Europe to diverge and industrialize and become advanced wasn't necessarily technology or science, or even social structures, democracy, representative government, anything like that.
Mhm.
That it was just luck, basically. It was
Right.
contingency.
Yeah. Right.
In that the models that we see that kind of have this long-term progressive ideas maybe are missing something, which is the key role of just random
Mhm.
processes and events and geographical constraints, or all sorts of different kind of contingencies, which I think is really interesting. And because I think even though Civ does have this, in order to progress in Civ, you have to research technologies, right? And each technology, and in the new Civ, they're not just, I don't know if you'd even call them technologies. There's standard technologies like gunpowder, things like that,
Mhm.
but there's also um, other types of things like
The
civic,
policies and these things. Yeah.
policies
Yeah.
and things like that, that
Mhm.
you can form governmental structures of different types and things like that.
Right.
So you've got all of that. You've got this progress idea, right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, contingency plays a fairly important role. I
Right.
would say that it's a role that kind of starts at the beginning, really. If you have a favorable placement on the board,
Mhm.
your whole trajectory is much easier.
Mhm.
And you can tell this because just the AI playing the other characters, some of them get very vast and become very good. Other ones stay quite weak. So, and it's
Right.
presumably the same AI. It'd be very interesting. I've always wondered. I don't think there's a simulation mode. I've looked for it, but if you could just set up a world and just let it play, and then do the same map and let it play again and see what
Right.
happens, what would happen? But I feel like that kind of, especially geographical, um, I don't want to call it determinism, because there's other random elements, but that geographical favoring or whatever, that kind of legacy that you get based on where you're set and the kind of resources that your civilization has at its disposal at the beginning, and what the neighbors are, how close they are, how aggressive they are, etc. That can really determine so much of the game later on.
Yeah, indeed. So I mean, if you can found your city without ever moving the settler to start the game, because there's a river right there, or you're near the sea and near some mineral deposits, there's a huge difference between that and roaming around for 6 turns. Which, if you're going to try and translate the game into, a history, the story of history, as it were, you kind of wandered around for like for generations before kind of founding, and suddenly your neighbor's Egypt or a superpower. Sorry for you. I think it's been interesting, the newer game, in the sense that we're kind of getting into this meta idea of the gameplay, because Civ does have this reputation for that tech tree, right? This is your blueprint for getting from a bunch of barely clothed peoples on the plains to the city on the hill, right?
Right.
And I feel that Civ 6 makes a real effort to break you out of that a little bit. Democracy is not demonstrably kind of the most obvious government type to go for. The penalties for communism, for example, are not perhaps as loaded as they were in the early 90s with the early games. And also things like city-states and really trying to create this idea that you can persist, because it's something that, in my experience, Tonio, and I'd love to hear you talk about this as well, one of the interesting gameplay aspects of Civilization is it does kind of push you to conquer. Or you could push back against that too, because does it push you to conquer? Is it the player base that likes to conquer? But it feels to me that since Civilization 4 in particular, there's been this effort by the developers for Axis Games to really kind of say, hey, you could be cultured and you could win. Yeah. You could be a religious entity. You could win through sheer religious influence. And it feels like a struggle they've been going through for several games now.
That's interesting. Yeah. I think in Civ 3, the first iteration that I really knew, conquering was pretty much the way to go. You were definitely edged towards that. And I think Civilization Revolution, the I guess more handheld and kind of stripped down version of Civ, same thing. Very much conquering is kind of the standard path. But yeah, as far as I can tell from Civilization 6, elements from Civ 4 and Civ 5, like cultural victory and religion and stuff, religious victory where you win by having the most glorious culture on the one hand, or by converting other civilizations to your religion. Those are, I think, much more kind of prominent in Civ 6. I don't have that many hours playing Civ 6 yet, so I'm not sure how it really plays out, but I feel like you're right. Like they're trying to push a non-conquering possibility. And so one of the things about history that's like global history on the long term that is intriguing to me is how places that would appear to be marginal at a given point can take on tremendous importance and significance later on. So like Europe is a great example. So the rise of the West, these, after the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Europe at least, was very marginal in comparison to sort of the great civilizations and cities and everything going on in Asia, in the Indian Ocean world and in East Asia. And yet, sometime on or around or after 1500, depending, the dating is very political almost. These once marginal places came to just play this central role, so that by the 19th century, they were not just dominant, militarily, but culturally, and we all wear European clothing, and and that dynamic is very interesting to me. How can you model this? Because if it was a cultural thing, right? Like what allows countries and civilizations, if you like to use the term, and a lot of global historians are uncomfortable with the term,
sure,
to rise, and how do they come out of seeming marginality to central dominance? Well, I mean, if we were to make a bullet point list of things that we would love to see in Civ 7, I think among them I would like to see large global contingencies, viruses and bacteria and epidemics and things like that, climate change, and because it's not just the 21st century that is affected by climate change. I mean, climate change episodes have really affected history at many different times and created sort of bottlenecks and major changes. And they affected different parts of the world in different ways. So the Vikings, for example, were tremendous beneficiaries of the medieval warm period, right? They colonized Greenland and went to the New World. And when that ended, those settlements, everything retracted and those settlements died away. So it'd be nice to see that. But yeah, what would you add? What would you add to the list of?
That's it. This is a great way to end it. This is fun. What really intrigued me about Civilization 6 before it came out, a lot of the preview stuff focused on how they're going to use the landscape. And so the way that this manifested itself in the game most directly is this use of districts in the city dynamic, which is cool. I think it gives you. The game doesn't explain this to you, but you'll do better if you specialize. So if you have like an industrial city and a cultural city and a religious city, and your smaller cities can do lots of different things. But if you, especially early on, if you kind of specialize a little bit, at least in my experience, you'll kind of prosper. And I like that. It gives the city's personality. I have to be honest, I was kind of hoping for more of an integration between kind of, the construction and the science of man man and women, of course, but man with the capital M, and the land. And in the game, you can discover natural wonders and things like this. I think they had grand ambitions for a clear integration of humanity's technology, humanity's existence, and the land that humanity occupies, and of course the world that humanity occupies. So I'm hopeful to see it coming. So I kind of go with you there to see something along those lines, whether it's global events or whether it's just, even to be honest, to be arguably less ambitious on my end, just to see a return to, you've become a very powerful coal-chewing nation. The coal is running out.
Yes.
You have basically destroyed the western half of your country. What do you do now? Maybe for Civ 8, there might be the transition from an industrial to a service economy or something like that. These are things that are on my mind and recently for some reason. And I'd be intrigued to see how Civ does it. I think that we've mentioned other games in this conversation, the Paradox games. They have the virtue of being games where, you're not going to quote unquote win. Where Civ feels tied to that to me. Yeah. For better and for worse. So how they would get away from that, I don't know.
Yeah, I think they could though. I think there's room in the interface is so great, the idea is so great. I don't think that it would ruin the experience to have some of these other elements included. And for that token, when you go back to fighting the Greeks after we get off, I really feel like next time, Sid Meier's, if you're listening to this, 3 victories, 3 defeats by a technologically superior power, and you get some of that technology. It's just should be that way. And then, that would actually maybe decrease war, because you wouldn't want to necessarily go to war with your people nearby.
And give them all your secrets.
Yeah, they'd end up with tanks. But yeah.
Well, Tonio, thanks so much. I think that's a great place to leave it. We're really glad to have had you.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Maybe have you back sometime in the future. And thanks everyone for listening and for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did like the video, please give us a like, a thumbs up below. There are links on the YouTube page to our podcast, which features the full-length version of this conversation, and to the Patreon page if you feel like supporting our work financially and helping us out. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.